The cold came early that year, settling over the hills of eastern Kentucky like a hand pressing down on the land. By the first week of November, frost had already killed the last of the gardens, and the old-timers at the feed store were saying it would be the worst winter in 30 years. They said it the way old-timers always said such things, half warning, half prophecy. And the people of Hadley's Creek listened and stacked their firewood a little higher and checked the seals on their windows and hoped for the best. Alma Watkins was 81 years old, and she had seen enough winters to know that hoping wasn't enough. She lived alone in a small clapboard house at the end of a gravel road, 3 miles from town and a lifetime away from the girl she'd once been. Her husband Clyde had built the house with his own hands in 1962, back when they were young and foolish enough to think love could keep you warm. He'd been gone 11 years now, buried in the little cemetery behind the Baptist church, and Alma had learned the hard way that love couldn't pay the heating bill. The house was drafty, the furnace was old, and the propane tank was down to a quarter full. She'd called the gas company twice, but they wanted payment on the past due balance before they'd deliver more. And the past due balance was more than Alma's Social Security check could cover. So she wore 2 sweaters instead of 1. And she kept the thermostat at 55, and she slept under every blanket she owned, which wasn't many, 3 to be exact. A quilt her mother had made before the war, faded now and thin in places, a wool blanket she'd bought at the Walmart in Pikeville back when Clyde was still alive and they could afford such things, and a fleece throw with a pattern of cardinals on it, a Christmas gift from her niece in Lexington, who called once a year and never visited. 3 blankets, and still she woke in the night with her teeth chattering and her bones aching from the cold. It was a Thursday evening when the stranger appeared. Alma was sitting in her kitchen, eating soup from a can she'd heated on the stove because the microwave had stopped working in September, and she couldn't afford to fix it. The sun had set an hour ago, and the darkness outside the window was complete. No streetlights out here, no neighbors close enough to see, just the black press of night and the wind rattling the storm door. She heard the engine first, a low rumble that grew louder, then coughed and sputtered and died somewhere at the end of her driveway. Alma set down her spoon and listened, footsteps on gravel. Heavy, uneven. Then a knock on the door, not loud, not demanding, just 3 slow raps that seemed to carry the weight of exhaustion. Alma was not a fearful woman. She had lived too long and lost too much to be afraid of strangers, but she was careful. She turned on the porch light and looked through the window beside the door before she opened it. The man on her porch was maybe 60, with a weathered face and a gray beard that needed trimming. He wore a leather jacket that had seen better decades, and his jeans were dark with mud and what might have been oil. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and his shoulders were hunched against the cold in a way that made him look smaller than he probably was. Behind him, at the end of the driveway, Alma could see the dark shape of a motorcycle tilted on its side. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was rough, scraped thin by the wind. "I'm sorry to bother you. My bike broke down about a mile back, and I pushed it as far as I could. I saw your light." He paused, a shiver running through him. "I don't suppose I could use your phone to call for a tow?" Alma looked at him, really looked. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the blue tinge to his lips, the way his hands trembled, even shoved in his pockets. She saw a man who had been cold for too long and was trying not to show it. "Phone's in the kitchen," she said, and stepped aside to let him in. His name was Walt Brennan. He told her that while he stood in her kitchen, holding the phone with fingers that shook so badly he had to dial the number twice. He was from Ohio, he said, on his way to visit his daughter in Tennessee. He'd taken the back roads because he liked the quiet, liked the way the hills rolled out in front of him like a promise. He hadn't counted on the cold, or the dark, or the engine trouble that had stranded him on a road so empty it might as well have been the moon. The tow company couldn't come until morning. Earliest they could manage, the dispatcher said, was 7 a.m. Walt thanked her and hung up and stood in Alma's kitchen, looking like a man who had just been told the world was ending and there was nothing to be done about it. "You'll freeze out there," Alma said. "I've slept in worse." "Not tonight you won't." She said it the way she said most things, matter of fact, leaving no room for argument. "I've got a couch. It's not much, but it's warm. Warmer than that bike of yours." Walt started to protest, but Alma cut him off with a look she'd perfected raising 4 children and burying 2. He closed his mouth and nodded. She made him tea, the good kind, the loose leaf she saved for special occasions, and sat with him at the kitchen table while he wrapped his hands around the mug and let the warmth seep back into his bones. They talked a little. He told her about his daughter, about the grandkids he'd never met, about the wife who'd left him 15 years ago and the road that had become his home ever since. Alma told him about Clyde, about the house he'd built, about the winters that got harder every year. She didn't tell him about the propane tank or the heating bill. Some things weren't for strangers to know. Around 9 o'clock, she showed him to the couch and brought him a pillow and the wool blanket from her bed. It was the warmest one she had, thick and heavy, the kind of blanket that could hold the heat in. Walt looked at it, then at her. "Ma'am, I can't take your blanket. It's just for the night. You'll be cold. I've got others." The lie came easy, the way small lies do when they're wrapped in kindness. "Go on, get some sleep. Tow truck will be here before you know it." He hesitated, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or shame, or some mix of the two that didn't have a name. Then he took the blanket and sat down on the couch, pulling it up around his shoulders. "Thank you," he said. "I won't forget this." Alma turned off the lamp and went to her bedroom. She lay down under her mother's quilt and the fleece throw with the cardinals, and she pulled them tight around her and tried not to shiver. The cold crept in anyway, finding the gaps, settling into her joints like an old enemy who knew all her weaknesses. She didn't sleep much that night, but she didn't regret the blanket either. Some things mattered more than being warm. In the morning, the tow truck came at 7 sharp. Alma made coffee and toast, and Walt ate standing up, his eyes on the window, watching the driver load his broken bike onto the flatbed. When it was time to go, he stood in her doorway, the wool blanket folded in his arms. "Keep it," Alma said. "Ma'am." "You've got a long ride ahead, and that jacket of yours isn't worth a damn in this cold." She smiled, the kind of smile that brooked no argument. "Keep it. Think of me when you're warm." Walt looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notepad and a pen, the kind truckers and bikers carried to jot down directions or phone numbers. He wrote something, tore off the page, and pressed it into her hand. "If you ever need anything," he said, "anything at all, you call this number." Before she could respond, he was down the porch steps and climbing into the cab of the tow truck. She watched it pull away, the flatbed with his motorcycle disappearing down the gravel road, and then she looked at the paper in her hand, a phone number, and beneath it, 2 words, Iron Horseman. Alma didn't know what that meant. She folded the paper and tucked it into her apron pocket and went back inside to wash the breakfast dishes. She didn't know that Walt Brennan was making a phone call from the tow truck's cab, his voice low and urgent. She didn't know that by noon, the call would reach a man named Shepard in Tulsa, and that Shepard would make calls of his own. She didn't know that sometimes a single blanket, given freely in the cold, could set something in motion that would change everything. All Alma knew was that the house felt emptier than usual, and the cold felt colder, and somewhere on a highway heading south, a stranger was wrapped in her warmth. That was enough for now. That was all she needed to know. The days after Walt left were harder than the days before. The cold deepened, settling into the hills like it meant to stay, and the propane tank dropped from 1/4 to 1/8. Alma kept the thermostat at 50 and wore 3 sweaters and spent most of her time in the kitchen, where the oven could provide a little extra warmth if she left the door cracked open after cooking. It wasn't safe, she knew that, but neither was freezing to death in your own home. She thought about calling her niece in Lexington, but pride stopped her. Linda had her own life, her own problems, and Alma had never been the kind of woman who asked for help. She'd been raised to make do, to get by, to solve her own problems, and keep her troubles to herself. That was the mountain way, and it was too late in life to learn a different one. On Friday, the phone rang. Alma picked it up, expecting a telemarketer, or maybe the gas company calling about her bill again. "Mrs. Watkins?" The voice was male, unfamiliar, with a roughness that reminded her of Walt. "Speaking." "My name's Shepard. I'm a friend of Walt Brennan's. He told me what you did for him." Alma frowned, trying to place the name. "I didn't do anything. Just gave the man a place to sleep." "You gave him your blanket. Your only warm blanket, from what he tells me, in the middle of November, with winter coming on hard. There was a pause. "That's not nothing, Mrs. Watkins. That's something." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "I'd like to come by and see you," Shepard continued. "Tomorrow, if that's all right. I've got some things I'd like to talk about." "I don't need charity." "It's not charity." His voice was steady, patient. "It's a conversation, that's all. Will you be home around noon?" Alma looked around her kitchen, the cracked linoleum, the oven door propped open, the sweaters layered over her thin frame, and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not hope, exactly. Something smaller than that, more fragile. Curiosity, maybe, or the simple human need to talk to someone who wasn't a bill collector or a recorded message. "I'll be here," she said. "I'm always here." She spent Friday night and Saturday morning in a state of restless anticipation. She cleaned the house as best she could, though her joints ached and the cold made every movement slow. She baked biscuits from scratch, using the last of her flour and the butter she'd been saving for Thanksgiving. She put on her good dress, the navy blue one she wore to church on Easter, and she waited. At noon exactly, she heard them coming. The sound started low, a distant rumble that could have been thunder or a truck on the highway. But it grew, swelling up the valley like a wave, until the windows rattled and the dishes trembled in the cupboards. Alma went to the front door and opened it, and what she saw made her grip the door frame for support. Motorcycles, not one or two, but dozens, pouring up her gravel driveway in a river of chrome and black leather. They kept coming, filling her yard, spilling onto the grass, lining up along the road in both directions. The noise was tremendous, a roar that drowned out thought, and then, all at once, it stopped. The engines cut off in a ragged cascade, leaving behind a silence that felt almost holy. Alma counted without meaning to. 50, 100, 200, more than she could keep track of. Men and women in leather jackets, their breath fogging in the cold air, their eyes turned toward the small clapboard house at the end of the gravel road. At the front of the formation, a man dismounted and removed his helmet. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a gray beard and eyes the color of slate. He walked toward the porch with the unhurried gait of someone who had all the time in the world, and when he reached the bottom of the steps, he stopped and looked up at Alma. "Mrs. Watkins," he said, "I'm Shepard. We spoke on the phone." Alma's voice came out smaller than she intended. "You didn't say you were bringing an army." The corner of his mouth twitched. "I said I wanted to talk. I didn't say I'd be coming alone." Behind him, the riders had begun to dismount. They moved with quiet purpose, gathering in groups, some of them pulling boxes and bags from saddlebags and the beds of pickup trucks that had arrived with the convoy. Alma saw blankets, stacks of them, thick and colorful, and cases of canned goods and jugs of water and things she couldn't identify from the porch. "What is all this?" she asked. Shepard climbed the steps until he was standing in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Walt told us about you," he said. "Told us about your house, your situation, the blanket you gave him when you didn't have one to spare. He's been riding with us for 20 years, Mrs. Watkins. He's family. And when family tells us about someone who showed them kindness, we pay attention." Alma shook her head, overwhelmed. "I just gave him a blanket. I didn't." "You gave him more than a blanket." Shepard's voice was quiet but firm. "You gave him warmth when you had none. You gave him shelter when you had nothing. You treated a stranger like he mattered, and that's rarer than you know." He turned and gestured to the riders behind him. Two men came forward carrying a large cardboard box. They set it on the porch at Alma's feet and stepped back. "Open it," Shepard said. Alma bent down, her knees protesting, and lifted the flaps. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a quilt. Not a cheap thing from a discount store, but a real quilt, hand-stitched, with a pattern of interlocking rings in shades of blue and gold. She lifted it out, feeling the weight of it, the warmth it promised. "Made by the wives and mothers of the Iron Horsemen," Shepard said. "Every chapter contributed a square. It's yours now." Alma pressed the quilt to her chest, her eyes stinging. She hadn't cried in years, not since Clyde's funeral, but she felt the tears building now, pushing against a dam she'd thought was unbreakable. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "You can," Shepard said, "and you will. But that's not all." He nodded to the riders, and they began to move. Men and women streamed toward the house, carrying boxes and bags, their boots heavy on the porch steps. They filed past Alma like a river, parting around a stone, disappearing into her house with their burdens. Alma watched, speechless, as her kitchen filled with groceries, canned goods and dry pasta, bags of flour and sugar, coffee and tea, and things she hadn't been able to afford in months. Her living room filled with blankets and pillows, her bathroom filled with toiletries and medical supplies. Someone had brought firewood and was stacking it neatly beside the back door. Someone else was inspecting her furnace, tools in hand, making notes on a clipboard. "What are you doing?" Alma asked, her voice breaking. Shepard stood beside her on the porch, watching his people work. "What we do," he said simply, "taking care of our own." "But I'm not one of you." He looked at her, and his hard eyes softened. "You are now." The work continued for hours. Riders came and went, some staying to help, others heading back to town for more supplies. By late afternoon, Alma's propane tank had been filled by a truck that arrived without explanation or invoice. Her furnace had been repaired, the faulty igniter replaced with a new one. The drafty windows had been sealed with plastic and tape, and the gaps around the doors had been stuffed with weather stripping. Alma sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by more food than she'd seen in years, and tried to make sense of what was happening. She felt like she was dreaming, like she might wake up at any moment and find herself alone again in the cold, empty house. But the quilt in her lap was real. The warmth from the furnace was real. The sound of voices and laughter filling her home was real. And for the first time in a very long time, Alma Watkins did not feel alone. Around 5 o'clock, when the sun was setting and the cold was creeping back in, Shepard found her in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, the quilt still in her lap, a cup of tea growing cold in front of her. "You doing all right?" he asked. She looked up at him, this stranger who had brought an army to her doorstep, and she didn't know whether to thank him or scold him or both. "I don't understand," she said. "Why would you do all this for someone you've never met?" "Yeah." Shepard pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant, as if he were looking at something far away. "My mother was a lot like you," he said finally. "Proud, stubborn, the kind of woman who'd give you the coat off her back and then pretend she wasn't cold. She raised me alone after my father died, worked 2 jobs, never asked anyone for help." He paused. "She froze to death in her own house when I was 23. Furnace broke, and she didn't want to bother anyone about it. By the time the neighbors found her, it was too late." Alma's breath caught in her throat. "I started the Iron Horseman 5 years later," Shepard continued. "Built it on a simple idea. Nobody rides alone. Nobody freezes alone. Nobody suffers alone if there's something we can do about it." He looked at her, his slate-colored eyes steady. "When Walt called and told me about you, about the blanket, about the cold house, about the woman who gave everything she had to a stranger, I knew we had to come. Because you're the kind of person this world needs more of, and I'll be damned if I let you go the way my mother did." Alma didn't know what to say. She sat there, the quilt clutched to her chest, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. It was all she could manage. Shepard nodded and stood. "We'll be back," he said. "Not tomorrow, not next week, but we'll be back. You're on our list now, Mrs. Watkins. That means someone will check on you every month, make sure you've got what you need. That means if something breaks, you call the number Walt gave you and we'll fix it. That means you're not alone anymore." He walked to the door, then paused and looked back. "One more thing," he said. "That blanket you gave Walt, he still has it. Sleeps with it every night. Says it's the warmest thing he's ever owned." A faint smile crossed his face. I think he meant more than the wool. And then he was gone, out the door and down the steps, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked back to his motorcycle. One by one, the engines roared to life, and the convoy began to pull out, a river of chrome and leather flowing back down the road toward the highway. Alma stood on her porch and watched them go, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders, the cold held at bay for the first time in weeks. The sound of the engines faded into the distance, replaced by the ordinary silence of the hills, and she stood there until the last taillight disappeared around the bend. Then she went inside, turned up the thermostat, and sat down in Clyde's old armchair by the window. She was warm, she was fed, she was not alone. and somewhere out on the highway, 600 riders carried her story with them, ready to tell it to anyone who would listen. Word traveled fast in Hadley's Creek. By Sunday morning, everyone in town knew about the motorcycles, the roar of engines that had shaken windows, the convoy that had stretched half a mile down the mountain road, the strangers in leather who had descended on Alma Watkins' house like something out of a movie. The stories grew with each telling. Some said there had been 1,000 bikers. Others said they'd seen guns and chains. A few whispered that Alma must have gotten herself mixed up in something dangerous, something criminal, something no good Christian woman should be part of. Alma heard the whispers when she went to church that Sunday. She felt the stares, the sidelong glances, the way conversations stopped when she walked past. People who had known her for 50 years suddenly didn't know where to look. Pastor Harold greeted her with his usual handshake, but his smile was tight and his eyes kept drifting to the door as if he expected trouble to walk through it at any moment. She sat in her usual pew, third row from the back, and listened to a sermon about charity and compassion that felt pointed in ways she didn't appreciate. Afterward, in the fellowship hall, she poured herself a cup of coffee and waited for someone to ask her what had really happened. It was Mabel Crenshaw who finally worked up the nerve. Mabel was 76, a deacon's wife, and the closest thing Hadley's Creek had to a town gossip. She sidled up to Alma with a plate of cookies and a look of poorly disguised curiosity. "Alma," she said, her voice pitched low, "we've all been worried about you. Those men who came to your house, are you in some kind of trouble?" Alma took a sip of her coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Mabel uncomfortable. "No trouble," she said finally. "Just kindness." "Kindness?" Mabel's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "From bikers?" "From people," Alma said. "People who saw a need and filled it. More than I can say for most folks around here." She hadn't meant it to come out so sharp, but she didn't take it back either. Mabel's mouth opened and closed like a fish, and then she retreated to the safety of the cookie table, already whispering to the women gathered there. Alma finished her coffee, collected her coat, and walked out into the cold November air. She didn't look back. The drive home took her past the gas station, the post office, the feed store where the old-timers gathered to complain about the weather and the government. She saw faces in windows, eyes tracking her car as it passed. By tomorrow, she knew, the whole county would be talking. Let them talk. She had a full propane tank and a warm house and a quilt made by strangers who cared more about her than neighbors she'd known for half a century. That was worth a few whispers. When she got home, there was a truck in her driveway. It was old, a Ford from the 80s, more rust than paint, with a camper shell over the bed. A man was sitting on her porch steps, waiting. He stood when she pulled up, and she recognized him immediately, the weathered face, the gray beard, the leather jacket that had seen better days. Walt Brennan. "Mrs. Watkins," he said as she climbed out of her car, "hope you don't mind me stopping by." Alma walked up the steps and stood in front of him. He looked different than he had that night, less desperate, more rested, but his eyes still carried that same depth, that same weight of miles and years. "I thought you'd be in Tennessee by now," she said. "I was. Saw my daughter, met the grandkids, stayed a few days." He paused, looking out at the hills. "Then I turned around and came back." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches of the maple tree in the yard. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said. "About this house, this road, this place at the end of nowhere. About a woman who gave a stranger her last warm blanket and pretended she had more." He looked at her. "I wanted to make sure you were all right. That shepherd and the boys took care of you." "They did." Alma gestured toward the door. "Come inside. I'll make coffee." They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where they'd sat a week ago, and Alma poured coffee into the same mugs. But everything felt different now. The house was warm, the pantry was full, and the quilt from the Iron Horseman was draped over the back of Clyde's armchair like it had always belonged there. Walt wrapped his hands around his mug and looked around the kitchen, taking in the changes. "Shepherd doesn't do things halfway," he said. "No, he doesn't." Alma sat down across from him. "He told me about his mother." Walt nodded slowly. "She was a good woman. Proud, like he said. Too proud to ask for help, even when she needed it." He paused. Shepard spent the last 30 years making sure nobody else ends up the way she did. That's what the Iron Horsemen are about. Not the bikes, not the leather, the people. Alma thought about that. She thought about Mabel Crenshaw and the whispers in the fellowship hall, about neighbors who had driven past her house for years without stopping, about a world that seemed to have forgotten how to take care of its own. "Why did you come back?" she asked again. "Really?" Walt set down his mug and met her eyes. "Because you reminded me of someone I used to be, someone who had nothing, who expected nothing, who figured the world owed them exactly what they'd always gotten, which was not much." He paused. "I spent a lot of years on the road feeling sorry for myself, feeling like I didn't matter, like nobody would notice if I disappeared. And then I broke down on a mountain road in the middle of nowhere, and a woman I'd never met opened her door and gave me everything she had." His voice roughened, and he looked away for a moment. "You didn't just give me a blanket, Mrs. Watkins. You gave me proof that there's still good in the world. That kindness isn't dead, that strangers can still be family if you let them." He looked back at her. "I came back because I wanted you to know that, and because I wanted to ask you something." "Ask me what?" "Thanksgiving's in 2 weeks. The Iron Horsemen do a dinner every year. All the chapters, all the families, everyone together. It's held at Shepard's place in Tulsa." He hesitated. "I'd like you to come, as my guest." Alma stared at him. "Tulsa's 4 hours from here." "I know. I'll drive you myself. Pick you up Wednesday, bring you back Friday." He smiled, a little sheepish. "The truck's not much to look at, but the heater works." She should have said no. She was 81 years old. She didn't know these people, and Tulsa might as well have been the moon for all she'd traveled in the last decade. But something stirred in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite excitement, but something close. Something that felt like being alive. "I don't have anything to bring," she said. "For the dinner." Walt's smile widened. "Mrs. Watkins, you're bringing yourself. That's more than enough." Alma looked at him, this stranger who had stumbled into her life on a cold night and refused to stumble back out. She thought about Clyde, who would have laughed at the absurdity of it all and then told her to go. She thought about her mother's quilt, too thin now to keep anyone warm, and the new quilt draped over Clyde's chair, made by hands she would never meet. "All right," she said. "I'll come." Walt's face broke into a grin, and for a moment he looked 10 years younger. "You won't regret it," he said. "I promise." He left an hour later, after 2 more cups of coffee and a conversation that wandered from his daughter to her late husband, to the state of the roads and the price of gasoline. Alma stood on the porch and watched his truck rattle down the driveway, its taillights glowing red in the gathering dusk. She went back inside and sat in Clyde's chair, the quilt pulled up around her shoulders. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a place where things could happen, where stories could begin, where an 81-year-old woman could say yes to an adventure she never saw coming. 2 weeks until Thanksgiving. 2 weeks until she'd meet the 600 strangers who had fixed her furnace and filled her pantry and stitched a quilt to keep her warm. 2 weeks until she'd find out what it meant to be part of something bigger than herself. Alma closed her eyes and smiled. For the first time in 11 years, she was looking forward to a holiday. Walt's truck pulled into Alma's driveway at 9 o'clock on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. The morning was cold and clear, the sky a hard blue that promised frost by nightfall. Alma was already waiting on the porch, a small suitcase at her feet and her good coat buttoned up to her chin. She had packed light, a change of clothes, her toiletries, the navy blue dress she'd worn to church. She didn't know what to expect, so she'd prepared for everything and nothing. Walt climbed out of the truck and walked up the steps to take her suitcase. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt under his leather jacket, and his beard had been trimmed. He looked almost respectable. "You ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." He loaded her bag into the camper shell and helped her into the passenger seat. The truck's interior was worn but clean, with a blanket folded on the bench seat and a thermos of coffee wedged between them. Walt started the engine, and they pulled out of the driveway, leaving the little clapboard house behind. The drive took them through the hills of eastern Kentucky, past small towns and abandoned coal mines and churches with hand-painted signs. Alma watched the landscape roll by, thinking about how long it had been since she'd traveled anywhere. Years, maybe a decade. The world had shrunk down to her house and her road and the weekly trip to town for groceries, and she'd stopped noticing how small it had become. Walt didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable. He pointed out landmarks now and then, a diner where he'd eaten the best biscuits of his life, a stretch of road where he'd once laid down his bike and walked away without a scratch, a town where he'd met his ex-wife 40 years ago and thought he'd found forever. His voice was easy, unhurried, the voice of a man who had made peace with his past. They crossed into Tennessee, then angled west toward Oklahoma. The hills flattened into plains, and the trees thinned out until there was nothing but grass and sky and the endless ribbon of highway stretching toward the horizon. Alma had never seen country like this, so open, so exposed. It made her feel small in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. They stopped for lunch at a truck stop outside of Fort Smith, Arkansas. Walt ordered burgers and fries, and Alma ate more than she'd eaten in months, surprised by her own appetite. The waitress called her honey and refilled her coffee without being asked, and for a little while, sitting in that vinyl booth with the smell of grease and the hum of conversation around her, Alma felt like she was part of the world again. They reached Tulsa just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Walt navigated through the city streets with the ease of long familiarity, past strip malls and housing developments and industrial parks until they turned onto a road that led away from the sprawl and into a stretch of land that still remembered what Oklahoma had looked like before the highways came. Shepard's place was at the end of that road. It wasn't what Alma had expected. She'd imagined something rough, maybe, a compound or a warehouse, the kind of place where outlaws gathered in movies. Instead, she found a ranch, a real ranch with a main house and a barn and outbuildings scattered across several acres of land. Trucks and motorcycles filled the gravel lot in front of the house, and people moved between the buildings with the purposeful energy of a community preparing for something big. Walt parked the truck and came around to help Alma out. Her legs were stiff from the drive, and she leaned on his arm as they walked toward the main house. People nodded at them as they passed, men in leather jackets, women in jeans and sweaters, children running between the adults with the wild joy of kids set loose in open space. A few of them looked at Alma with curiosity, but most just smiled and went back to what they were doing. The main house was large and warm, with a fire crackling in a stone fireplace and the smell of roasting meat drifting from the kitchen. Shepard met them at the door. "Mrs. Watkins," he said, taking her hand in both of his. "Welcome." "Thank you for having me." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. Shepard guided her inside, past a living room crowded with people, and into a quieter hallway. He showed her to a small bedroom at the back of the house, simply furnished, with a quilt on the bed and a window that looked out over the fields. "Get some rest," he said. "Dinner's not until tomorrow, but there's food in the kitchen if you're hungry. Make yourself at home." He left her there, closing the door softly behind him. Alma sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. It was clean and warm, and nothing like the cold house she'd left behind in Kentucky. She thought about Clyde, about what he would say if he could see her now, 81 years old, 400 miles from home, a guest of strangers who had become something more. He would have laughed, she decided, and then he would have told her she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She slept better that night than she had in years. Thanksgiving morning dawned bright and cold. Alma woke to the sound of voices and the smell of coffee, and by the time she dressed and made her way to the kitchen, the house was already full of activity. Women moved between stoves and counters, orchestrating the kind of controlled chaos that only happened when a large meal was being prepared by people who knew what they were doing. Men carried tables and chairs from the barn, setting them up in long rows in a hall that had been cleared for the occasion. Children darted underfoot, stealing rolls and getting shooed away with affectionate swats. Alma stood in the doorway, uncertain where she fit. A woman appeared at her elbow, mid-50s, with gray-streaked hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She wore an apron dusted with flour, and her hands were quick and capable. "You must be Alma," she said. "I'm Ruth, Shepard's sister." She smiled. "Come on, we can use another pair of hands on the pies." Alma followed her to a corner of the kitchen where pie crusts waited to be filled. Ruth handed her a bowl of apple filling and a wooden spoon, and for the next 2 hours, Alma worked alongside women she'd never met, talking about recipes and grandchildren and the best way to keep a crust from getting soggy. Nobody asked her why she was there. Nobody treated her like a charity case or an outsider. They treated her like she belonged. The dinner started at 3 o'clock. The hall was packed, 200 people, maybe more, seated at long tables covered with white paper and decorated with autumn leaves and candles. The food was abundant and homemade, passed from hand to hand in a steady stream of bowls and platters: turkey and ham, mashed potatoes and gravy, green beans and corn, and rolls so fresh they steamed when you broke them open. Alma sat between Walt and Ruth, her plate piled higher than she could possibly finish. Around her, conversations rose and fell like music, voices blending into a warm hum of family and fellowship. She recognized some of the faces from that day at her house: the men who had carried boxes, the women who had stocked her pantry, but most were strangers, and yet none of them felt strange. Before the meal began, Shepherd stood at the head of the room and raised his hand for silence. The conversations faded and 200 faces turned toward him. "Every year," he said, "we gather here to give thanks, not just for the food on this table, but for each other, for the family we've built, for the road we've traveled together." He paused, his slate-colored eyes sweeping across the room. "This year, we have a special guest. Some of you know her story already. A few weeks ago, a woman in Kentucky opened her door to a stranger. She gave him shelter. She gave him warmth. She gave him the only blanket she had, even though it meant she'd go cold herself." He looked at Alma, and the room followed his gaze. "That woman is here with us today. Her name is Alma Watkins, and she's the reason we do what we do. She's proof that kindness still exists in this world, that generosity isn't dead, that strangers can still be family." He raised his glass. "To Alma." 200 voices echoed the toast. "To Alma." Alma felt her face flush, her eyes sting. She didn't trust her voice, so she just nodded once and lifted her own glass in return. The meal continued, but something had shifted. People stopped by her seat to introduce themselves, to shake her hand, to thank her for coming. An old man with a white beard told her she reminded him of his grandmother. A young woman with a baby on her hip said she hoped to be half as strong when she was Alma's age. A boy of about 10 asked if she'd really given away her only blanket, and when she said yes, he looked at her like she was a superhero. By the time the plates were cleared and the pies were served, Alma felt like she'd known these people her whole life. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for 11 years felt distant now, like a memory of a memory. She was surrounded by voices and laughter and warmth, and she understood, finally, what Shepherd had meant when he said she was part of something. This was it. This was what belonging felt like. After dinner, Walt found her on the porch, looking out at the fields under a sky full of stars. The air was cold, but Alma didn't mind. She had warmth enough inside her to last the winter. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing me here." Walt stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "Thank you for saying yes." They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars. "Clyde would have liked this," Alma said quietly. "He always said I needed to get out more." "Smart man." "He was." She smiled. "He really was." The door opened behind them, and Shepherd stepped out onto the porch. He had 2 mugs of coffee in his hands, and he offered one to Alma. "You doing all right?" he asked. "Better than all right." She took the mug and wrapped her hands around it. "I don't know how to thank you for all of this." Shepherd shook his head. "You already did. The night you gave Walt that blanket, you thanked us in advance for everything we'd ever do for you." He looked out at the stars. "That's how kindness works, Mrs. Watkins. It doesn't wait for payment. It doesn't keep score. It just moves from person to person, changing everything it touches." He raised his mug in a small salute. "You started something that night, something bigger than you know, and we're all better for it." Alma looked at the stars, at the fields, at the 2 men standing beside her on the porch. She thought about the blanket she'd given away, the quilt she'd received, the journey that had brought her here. And she understood for the first time that kindness wasn't a transaction. It was a ripple, and once it started, it never stopped. Winter came hard that year, just like the old-timers had predicted. Snow fell thick across the hills of eastern Kentucky, burying roads and bending branches and turning the world into a quiet white stillness. But inside the little clapboard house at the end of the gravel road, Alma Watkins was warm. The furnace hummed steadily, fed by a propane tank that never seemed to run low. Every 6 weeks, like clockwork, a truck from the gas company pulled up the driveway and filled it to the top. The bills were always marked paid in advance. Alma had stopped asking questions about that months ago. The pantry stayed full, too. Boxes arrived every few weeks. Canned goods and dry pasta, coffee and tea, sometimes fresh fruit or vegetables from someone's garden. There was never a return address, just a small card tucked inside with the Iron Horsemen logo and 2 words, "Stay warm." And then there were the visitors. They came alone or in pairs, riding up the mountain road on motorcycles that looked out of place against the snow-covered hills. They never stayed long, just long enough for a cup of coffee and a conversation, long enough to check that the heat was working and the roof wasn't leaking, and Alma had everything she needed. They called her Mrs. Watkins at first, then Alma, then, as the months passed and the visits accumulated, Ma. She liked that. She had never had children of her own, had never heard that word directed at her with affection. Now she heard it every few weeks, from men and women who had started as strangers and become something closer to family. Walt came most often. He'd sold his place in Ohio and moved to a small town about an hour south of Hadley's Creek, close enough to visit, but far enough to give them both space. He showed up every Sunday afternoon, regular as church, and they'd sit at her kitchen table and talk about nothing in particular: the weather, the news, the latest gossip from the Iron Horsemen. Sometimes he'd bring his daughter and the grandkids, and the house would fill with noise and laughter and the kind of chaos that Alma had forgotten she missed. Spring came late, but it came. The snow melted, the creek swelled, and the hills turned green in that sudden, fierce way they had every year. Alma stood on her porch one morning in early April, watching the mist rise from the valley below, and realized she had made it through the winter. Not just survived it, but lived it. Really lived it, with purpose and connection and people who cared whether she woke up the next day. That was when she decided to do something in return. The idea came to her slowly, the way good ideas often do. She thought about her neighbors, the ones who had whispered about her, yes, but also the ones who were struggling the same way she had struggled. Old Mrs. Patterson down the road, whose husband had died last summer and who lived alone on a fixed income. The Hensley family on the ridge, with 4 kids and a father who'd lost his job at the mine. The veterans at the big VFW hall in town, some of them homeless, some of them just barely hanging on. There were people in Hadley's Creek who needed help, people who were too proud to ask for it, just like she had been. Alma called the number Walt had given her the night they'd met. A voice she didn't recognize answered, and she asked to speak to Shepard. "Mrs. Watkins," he said when he came on the line. "Everything all right?" "Everything's fine," she said. "Better than fine. I want to talk to you about something." She told him her idea. A chapter of the Iron Horsemen here in Kentucky. Not a writing chapter, but a service chapter. A network of people who would check on the elderly, deliver supplies to those in need, fix furnaces and patch roofs, and do all the things that neighbors used to do before the world got too busy to care. She wanted to call it the Blanket Brigade, she said, after the gift that had started everything. Shepard was quiet for a long moment. "You want to run this?" he asked. "I'm 81 years old," Alma said. "I can't run much of anything, but I can organize, I can make phone calls, I can sit on this porch and keep track of who needs what." She paused. "I spent 11 years feeling useless, Mr. Shepard. I don't want to feel that way anymore." Another silence, then, slowly, she heard him chuckle. "Mrs. Watkins," he said, "I think you just might be the bravest person I've ever met." The Blanket Brigade launched that summer. It started small, just Alma and Walt and a handful of local volunteers, most of them members of the Baptist Church, who had heard about what the Iron Horsemen had done and wanted to be part of something similar. They held their first meeting in Alma's living room. 8 people crowded around her kitchen table, making lists of who in the county needed help and what kind of help they needed. Word spread. More volunteers joined. The Iron Horsemen sent supplies and money, and Shepard himself came out twice to help organize and train. By fall, the Blanket Brigade had chapters in 3 counties, with plans to expand into Tennessee and West Virginia the following year. Alma sat at the center of it all, her kitchen table covered with phone lists and donation records, her phone ringing at all hours with questions and updates and requests for help. She was tired in a way she hadn't been tired in years, but it was a good tired, the tired that came from doing something that mattered. Mabel Crenshaw showed up at her door one afternoon in October, a casserole dish in her hands and an expression on her face that Alma had never seen before. Humility, maybe, or something close to it. "I wanted to apologize," Mabel said, "for what I said, for what I thought. I was wrong about those bikers. I was wrong about you." Alma took the casserole and stepped aside to let her in. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." They talked for 2 hours. Mabel joined the blanket brigade the following week, and by Christmas, she was running the phone tree for the entire Eastern District. Winter came again, and Alma watched it from her warm house with something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too bright a word for someone who had lost as much as she had, but something steadier, deeper. The knowledge that her life had meaning, that her days had purpose, that she would leave the world a little better than she'd found it. On Christmas Eve, a convoy of motorcycles came up the mountain road. Not 600 this time. The snow made the ride too dangerous for most, but a solid 50, their engines rumbling through the quiet hills like a hymn. They filled Alma's yard and her porch and her living room, and they brought gifts and food and enough firewood to last until spring. Shepard was among them. He found Alma in her kitchen, supervising the coffee production, and he pressed a small box into her hands. "From all of us," he said. Inside the box was a pin, a silver blanket folded with the Iron Horseman logo embossed in the center. Beneath it, engraved in tiny letters, were the words, "Kindness never ends." "You're officially one of us now," Shepard said. "Honorary member, blanket brigade founder, and the toughest 82-year-old I've ever known." Alma looked at the pin, then at the man who had given it to her, then at the room full of people who had become her family. "Thank you," she said. The words weren't enough, but they never were. Some things couldn't be spoken. They could only be lived. That night, after the motorcycles had gone and the house had grown quiet, Alma sat in Clyde's armchair by the window. The quilt from the Iron Horseman was wrapped around her shoulders, and the pin was fastened to her collar, and outside the window snow was falling soft and steady, blanketing the hills in white. She thought about the night it had all started, the stranger at her door, the blanket she'd given away, the choice she'd made without knowing what it would become. She'd been cold that night. She'd been alone. She'd been one bad winter away from disappearing entirely, just another forgotten name in a forgotten place. But she had opened her door. She had offered what she had, and that single act of kindness had rippled outward, touching lives she would never see, changing a world she had thought was beyond changing. Clyde would have been proud. She knew that now, knew it deep in her bones. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence of the snow, and she smiled. 82 years old, and she was just getting started. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying flurries against the window, but inside, the house was warm, the pantry was full, and Alma Watkins, widow, volunteer, founder, friend, was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had given away her last blanket, and the world had wrapped itself around her in return. That was the miracle of kindness. It never left you with less than you started. It only multiplied, growing and spreading, and finding its way home, until the cold didn't matter anymore, until nothing mattered but the warmth.